Growing up, there's always one kid who's the shortest in their class, in first grade, second grade, all the way through to junior high. It may well be that they'll grow up to be normal height, or close to it, but parents often worry that they'll never catch up. And with height being a commodity today, especially for boys, mom and dad are taking more kids to the doctor to do something about it.
I'd say there's been a shift from seeing patients who aren't growing well, of course we still see those, to children who are short or whose parents perceive them to be short. For whatever the reason, people have become much more concerned about their child's height than there seems to have been in the past. So we see a lot of kids coming in now who really don't carry the medical definition for being short, but are shorter or relatively shorter than other children their age.
That's Dr. Lori Cohen, Chief of Pediatric Endocrinology and Diabetes and Professor of Pediatrics at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. She says even before doctors take a history and check for what might be making a kid short, parents and even kids have already set expectations for the visit.
One of the things that I've noticed that has changed over the past even several years, I always ask children when they come in their office why they're here. And I'm surprised by the number of them who say, I'm here to see if I can have growth hormone. I think that they're being exposed to children who are receiving growth hormone. And that was never the case. If you've got a disease, growth hormone deficiency, and it's relatively rare, when I was growing up, people didn't know anybody who was receiving growth hormone. Now they go off to summer camp and their friends go off to the nurse's office at night to get their growth hormone injections.
However, often there's nothing wrong with the child at all, and growth hormone will make little difference in how tall they end up.
The problem is that growth hormone is not a solution. The average gain of height in growth hormone is about a centimeter. That's a third of an inch for every year of treatment. It's not going to make somebody tall. And while there is a spectrum between being shorter and being taller, studies that equate being taller to being more successful, you're just not going to get your child to be 5 feet 10, 6 feet if they were destined to be 5 feet 5 inches or similar. So I think that there's this perception that we can give this expensive medication and add several inches of height. And that's just not the case. And the response is quite variable depending on the patient and presumably depending on why they're short.
Why they're short is often that the parents themselves are short, though doctors like Cohen take a look at everything.
We look at the growth charts to assess the growth pattern. We need to take a good medical history. That's going to include looking for medications that affect growth, low birth size, poor diet, signs and symptoms of other illnesses or endocrine conditions. Family history is really important, parents' heights, but also siblings and grandparents. About 80% of the difference in heights is heritable. We're also going to take a family history of pubertal patterns, as that's heritable as well. Both height and puberty are likely affected by hundreds of common gene variants that each have tiny effects. So just we need to look at the whole child. And then after that, we do a physical examination. That's going to include an accurate height and weight. I can tell you that I've had patients come in for falling off their growth charts, and when we remeasure them, their height is fine.
Children who lack growth hormone and who are very, very short certainly exist, but Cohen says they're much rarer than people think, between 1 in 4,000 and 1 in 10,000 children. Many of the rest are simply late bloomers who will end up more or less normal if given enough time. But sometimes parents don't have the patience.
The stereotypes the beliefs and assumptions that we have about short stature are very powerful. Even the doctors themselves, the general pediatrician or the pediatric endocrinologist who would prescribe growth hormone, many of them believe, without strong evidence or even weak evidence, that to be substantially shorter than average is going to interfere with a person's quality of life.
That's Dr. David Sandberg, pediatric psychologist and professor of pediatrics at the University of Michigan Medical School. He spent nearly 20 years examining the psychosocial impact of short stature.
I'm swimming against the current, so to speak, by pointing out that the research does not support many of the assumptions and beliefs we have about being taller than average or shorter than average.
But are there scars along the way for the child who's a lot shorter than their classmates? They're an easy target for name-calling. but the research is mixed.
There are many studies of psychological well-being in short children. A lot of them were sponsored by drug companies. Many of them have biases. And while some studies do indicate that childhood short stature affects psychological well-being, many others don't. And also, if psychological problems are present, they're usually not due to short stature. Studies that have looked at quality of life in short adults, it's usually normal, and growth hormone therapy doesn't predictably improve it.
Short children may feel conspicuously small, and their classmates' taunts of being a squirt may make them feel disrespected. But Sandberg's research, designed to look like a study on something else to get honest answers, show that big kids accept short kids as well as anyone.
Regardless of your height, whether you were significantly above average, average height, or substantially shorter, including those at the first percentile for the general population, they had the same number of close friends, whether they were boys or girls, and they were very short. They had the same number of close friends. Their friends were just as likely to be very tall as being very short. So there's a stereotype that we have. You might expect that somebody who's very short would hang out with other people of a similar height. That was not the case. As I said, they had the same number of friendships. They were considered as likable as anyone else, regardless of their height.
As far as reputation, Sandberg admits that classmates sometimes see shorter kids as younger than their chronological age, but they're not seen as any less athletic than others, and are no more likely to be picked on. However, there's one big caveat to that. That's the opinion of others. Short children may view themselves differently.
Perceiving yourself as different from others, even if others do not recognize you as being different, but you yourself may feel different, that is not a good experience. So in my line of work, one goal is to help the person to differentiate between what they might believe is a disadvantage versus challenges that they might experience, people making comments. The approach towards addressing those are really quite different.
Sandberg says that a lack of stature may seem so defining to a child that whenever they get teased or picked on, that must be the reason. So where does all of this leave a parent's pleas for growth hormone for their child? The FDA says synthetic growth hormone, available since 1985, can be prescribed for idiopathic short stature, meaning cause not known. But Cohen says it's not meant for kids on the fringe of normal. Only the smallest 1 or 2% should even be considered. So as is often the case, the biggest problem for short children isn't what's wrong with them. It's our societal norms. What's wrong with the rest of us?
Short stature is not a disease. It can indicate a medical condition for which evaluation is indicated, and I do urge people who have children who are short or shorter than expected for family, or certainly children who aren't growing well, to have an evaluation. But whether to treat or not treat a short child with growth hormone is a complicated decision. Not all short children should receive growth hormone. It doesn't mean that all children with idiopathic short stature won't benefit from growth hormone. But really, risk-benefit ratio needs to be taken into consideration. And really, children who are of normal height, who are expected to be within normal population range, even if that's going to be on the shorter side for society, really shouldn't be receiving growth hormone. They're healthy, and giving them a diagnosis, telling them that they're not going to function well, that's not a good thing.
You can find more about all of our guests on our website, radiohealthjournal.org. For more behind the scenes, follow Radio Health Journal on Facebook, Instagram, and X. This segment originally aired in June 2021 and was written and produced by Reed Pence. Our lead producer is Kristen Farah. Our executive producer is Amira Zaveri. I'm Elizabeth Westfield.